problems in which you have to classify things on a grid are typically invitations to practice two different categorization schemes simultaneously. This problem is a good example of that. You can kind of think of it as a puzzle. Consider the following four situations. Okay, these are what we are classifying. Negotiating a lease for drilling oil, drilling for oil, refining fuel from oil, and transporting fuel orders to retail locations by tanker trucks. Now consider the following grid, which indicates four positions marked A, B, C, and D. Got it. Each of these positions indicates differing levels of tangibility and control over the operation's external environment. This is what I mean by two different classification schemes. Because when we're talking about different operations, one of the things that we talk about is the degree of tangibility of the product, the whole goods versus services paradigm. That is the vertical axis on this grid, that categorization scheme. Okay. And then another thing that we often talk about when we're talking about labeling or categorizing operations is the degree of control over the environment. Does the operation enjoy a very high degree control over its environment or less so? Okay, that's the horizontal axis of this grid. Okay, so for this kind of problem or for this type of task, here's what I recommend. Work on one categorization scheme at a time. Oh, all right, like what? I highly recommend tangibility first. Say, all right, so what's that mean? It means don't jump in right away and try to put these labels here on these points. Instead, let's take these four different situations and just rank them in terms of tangibility. We're kind of breaking the problem down into steps. All right, now the four different situations, I don't want to, as I take notes, to keep writing these phrases like negotiating a lease for drilling oil. So I'm going to abbreviate. Negotiating will be the abbreviation for negotiating a lease for drilling oil. Drilling will be short for drilling for oil. Refining will be short for refining fuel from oil. And transporting will be short for transporting fuel orders to retail locations by tanker trucks. Oh, all right. Because let's look at this. First, negotiating. Negotiating a lease for drilling oil. Is that, as a process and an output, highly tangible or highly intangible? Negotiating a lease for anything. It doesn't have to be drilling for oil. Negotiating a lease, that's very much a service, the service of negotiation. Because the lease, other than like when you're eventually finished, may also be a very skinny piece of paper. I mean, it has some tangible essence. The lease is actually a promise. And the process of negotiation, that's all down to human skill level, but it doesn't have any physical essence. Anyway, that means that, and this is, I'm sort of pre-processing this list, that means that negotiating here, I would expect it to be very close to the top. I'm not saying which one of the points it is, I'm just saying it's a good example of a pure service. It's going to be something pretty close to the top, as opposed to drilling for oil. Okay, now drilling for oil, that is still, in a certain sense, a service, and that generally firms are hired to do that, although they're creating a well, so it has tangible elements, matter of fact, substantially more tangible elements than negotiating. So I'm not sure where drilling goes on this particular grid, but I know that it goes below negotiating. So this is, scratch work on the side. I'm just noting that it's going to be somewhere farther down. Now, refining fuel from oil. This is where you're producing fuel. Fuel is very much a tangible good. Oh, all right. So that means that this refining fuel, producing fuel from oil, that's got to go much farther down. Whatever point we pick needs to be much farther down. And then lastly, transporting fuel orders to retail locations by tanker trucks. Okay, here we're carrying fuel. Is that a good or a service? If our operation is just transportation, and that is not uncommon, it's called third-party logistics, that's what we do. We safely, accurately, and in a timely fashion move things between locations. That's a service, okay? The actual tangible good that we're moving is a distractor. What we provide the transportation is a service. So that's telling me, again, I'm not picking a spot yet, but that's got to go closer to the top. So I'm going to kind of squeeze it in here with negotiating. Transporting. All right, now notice that at this point still haven't like assigned any one of these things to one of these points because I am still deciding. What I have done is sorted them this way. Next step will answer the question, let's sort them this way. Let's go back over the same list and let's decide relative degree of control over the environment. Oh, now at this point, we are closing in on actually answering the question. Might as well make myself a little worksheet over here so I can check my answers later in the back of the book. Who did I assign to A? Who did I assign to B, to C, and then to D? Oh, I'm looking at my notes. And the one thing that I'm noticing, it's true, we'll be considering degree of control over the environment. But see how refining we had said, oh, you know, that's a good example of producing a good. That should be pretty low. See how there's really only one point that's down here by goods? That's point D. And I'm checking where does it correspond in terms of degree of control over the environment. It's over here to the right, meaning that this operation would have a very high degree of control over the environment. Let me think. Refining fuel from oil takes place in a refinery, takes place in a huge infrastructure, indoors, in high volume with lots of control systems. Yes, this is a good example of a type of operation that does have a high degree of control over its environment. Oh, so actually I already have one right here. Refining, that must be D. Okay. Now, what about the other ones? Well, notice that there's 2 points that are real high up, and we had said that there were 2 options that we felt were highly intangible, negotiating and transporting, versus we had said drilling, we're not sure where it goes yet, but it would go lower down on the tangibility scale. Notice that there is actually only one choice that is lower on the tangibility scale, and that's point C. Now then we want to check our understanding. That is midway in terms of degree of control over the environment, suggesting it's neither the best nor the worst. Drilling, yes. Okay, so drilling, you control a lot about your equipment, your procedures, how you want to proceed, and according to one timeline. Nonetheless, you have less control than a refinery does because you're working outdoors. You're working with nature. You're working with a certain number of unknowns under the ground. Okay, yeah, I'm just checking that move to the left, so to speak, is consistent or logical. That's a very good location for drilling. All right, well then I have this half done. Because the only thing now I need to decide is between, it's sort of like the assignments for negotiating the lease versus the assignment for transportation. Oh, and I have this choice A and B, and the only thing that on the grid that they differ in is the degree of control over the environment, the degree of control over everything that you work with. Which of these 2 operations has more control over the environment? Or maybe an easier way to think about it is which of these 2 operations has less control? Now you might think about, well, if you're transporting fuel to retail locations, what do you not control? We don't control traffic. Your trucks could get stuck in traffic. Yes, true. Okay, there is that. But compare that to, it's your job, like you're a law firm. You've been hired to negotiate a lease. Think of the things that you don't control. And you say, well, okay, it's a legal kind of operation. At least you'd be indoors. Yeah, true, you'd be indoors, but you know, you don't even know that you'll be in your own office because you're negotiating with somebody who has something that you want. For all you know, they may want you to show up at their location. Oh, but that's not the worst of it. Your operation is negotiation, meaning, you know, like give and take with another person. And from one lease to the next, you don't have any idea, and you certainly don't pick the cooperative nature of whoever the other party is. You're just going to find out if they really want to cooperate or not, and this all becomes part of what you have to do. It's a tough call, but it's really because of the human elements that if you look, negotiating the lease, there is far less that you control that really could affect the outcome. With the transportation, it's right. You don't control the traffic. You might get stuck in traffic. But even if there's heavy traffic along one of your routes, you still have the option of telling the later trucks to take another route. Whereas just with the give and take of negotiating a lease, especially a high stakes lease, there kind of isn't an equivalent of that. Oh, okay. So that's my argument for. We're still just trying to pick between A and B. Negotiating the lease, I would stick that here under less control of the environment. Okay, so that means negotiating goes here. And then transportation, it's right. You could get stuck in traffic, but there is so much that you do control in that particular situation. That it's fair enough to say that despite this one issue of traffic, you still have a relatively high degree of certainty concerning your environment.